That's something which these indigenous cultures have that's of great value. How would we be able to incorporate that into our culture, though, which seems so focused on the modern and the scientific? How would we be able to make that jump to include something which, we would use a word like primitive to try to describe?
Well, I think that those are the kind of words we may have to interrogate really, really deeply. And there may be a knowledge system that's been preserved by indigenous cultures, which is not primitive at all, which is super sensitive and sophisticated. And according to the Hopi, they talk about how at the end of the cycle, the elder white brother is going to come back and really be unpatronizing, uncondescending finally, and really try to share knowledge with them and learn from them too, because there may be things that these indigenous cultures have preserved as knowledge systems. They're going to be absolutely necessary for our near-term survival as a species.
I love the thought of that. I hope we do. We're long overdue to do that. How would our culture change? How would our day-to-day change if we could start doing more of what you seek for us?
Well, it's not anything that I seek for us. I mean, for me, it's like, and I try not to be prescriptive. I think it's happening. It will happen naturally, but it's up to the individuals to make a shift in perspective. It's like your whole world shifts when you make a shift in perspective. Everything shifts. Like William Carlos Williams said, a new world is only a new mind. So if you begin to move into this other framework of thought, then you begin to shift the whole reality around you. So if enough people start to do that, we could create a whole transformed situation.
Well, it seems like it was, as the quote that I read at the beginning of the hour, that you are identifying a problem and offering a kind of prognosis if we don't treat the problem. So if I put it in a prescriptive sense, and you didn't mean that way, I'm sorry, but you were talking about the psychic blockade in the book as being that which prevents us from being able to be healed from where we are. Who's responsible for the psychic blockade?
Yeah, well, and in that same chapter, I really talk about loss of soul also, that there's like this relationship to the anima, or the anima mundi, which is the soul of the world, that has been severed by the modern culture and modern civilization. And for me, once again, I see everything as a non-dual kind of evolutionary process. So, we had to gain this knowledge, this technological knowledge. We also had to alienate ourselves from nature, create this separate ego structure, so that we could really see things on a deeper level in terms of our science and our technology. But now, having made that separation, it's not the end of the road. The next step is a kind of reintegration at a higher level of consciousness. And that's the work that awaits us now, and the work that we have to do as individuals. When enough of us do it as individuals, the whole thrust of the society will naturally shift.
But still, I'm stuck with what you wrote, which I thought was very insightful, about this idea of a psychic blockade from a shamanic perspective that keeps us from being able to understand everything that really is going on. It forces us to think about the trivial, the trivial and the treacly, shoe sales.
Well, yeah, part of it is this fear culture, because as long as you're in this materialistic, nihilistic perspective, all that can matter to you is this life and this body and your immediate circumstances. So you kind of become frozen by anxiety, and therefore you can't think on a larger perspective. I mean, one thing I discuss in the book is how there's pretty excellent data now for supporting the theory of reincarnation. When you look at this guy, Ian Stevenson's research on children and past life memories, and even these children would have they would go back and they would find their previous incarnations and find that they had birthmarks that matched the wounds that had ended these past lives. He was a professor at the University of Virginia. Then there's this physicist, Amit Goswami, who's done this work really suggesting that quantum physics provides a basis for a hypothesis of how karma and reincarnation could function. So I think that our science is approaching, now able to sort of approach these subjects in a way.
All right. Well, then let's pick that up there when we continue with Danielle Pinchbeck. And I also want to tie back in, you're talking about UFO abductions and more on Coast to Coast AM. No words of Ross? No. You're listening to Coast AM with Art Bell, with guest host Ian Punnett. Okay. All right. So it's Coast to Coast AM with Art Bell, but Art has the night off. We think he might be back next week, but if not, I'll be here. And actually, Ross Mitchell will be then doing Coast to Coast Live, which was a recorded show tonight, just one of our first, but it could be Ross doing it next week. I think that'll be fun. And by the way, before, in the first hour of this show, Coast to Coast AM, we had gotten a few words on an update from Linda Godfrey. Linda Godfrey, journalist turned author who'd been working on these books about werewolves in the United States and tracking all of the various news accounts, reports, sightings of werewolves. And she had been experiencing one recently that she was on the trail of. And she talked just kind of coincidentally about something which I think goes right back into this conversation about the appearance of the white buffalo. And this is an all-white buffalo as opposed to an albino. And now in the same part of Wisconsin where there had been an all-white buffalo born, there are now sightings of all-white deer as well. And she said, this is very important. These are omens. These are signs. And so are many of the things which Daniel Pinchbeck talks about in the book 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl. And we'll tie that in with the other things he mentioned last hour, sometimes offhandedly, about UFOs, about abductions, about crop circles, and more next on Coast to Coast AM. In for Art, this is Ian Punnett. 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, author and wizard Daniel Pinchbeck with us on Coast to Coast AM. I want to go back to something you said last hour. I want to go back to about 5 things you said last hour, but the first of which is, just for the sake of argument, because I think you hit on a really interesting point. How would you define America's street drug problem in terms of what you have experienced with these other drugs around the world? That is to say, I mean, how do we look at the difference between drugs and medicines?
Well, I think our street drug problem is actually a spiritual crisis. I mean, it's a manifestation of our spiritual crisis. People turn to these substances. I mean, first of all, it's absolutely natural to seek altered states of consciousness. I mean, as Andrew Weil and many other people have pointed out, kids, will naturally whirl around or hold their breath, or do anything they can to experience altered states of consciousness. So it seems to be a natural dispensation to being human that you want to have experiences of different states of consciousness. Now, when you sort of artificially legislate against that and create a culture where there's really no kind of opening to sort of spiritual or mystical realities, people will seek sort of degraded substitutes for those kind of experiences, and they'll take whatever they can get their hands on.
All right. So then, in terms of, like you had mentioned, one particular type of medicine that you had taken, which gave an intense 5 or 6 minute effect. Right? What was the drug you mentioned?
Oh, yeah, I talked about dimethyltryptamine, or DMT.
Right. What's the difference between that, say, and how people describe the effects of crack, which is powerful but only lasts a few minutes?
Right. Well, I mean, that's interesting. I mean, first of all, there's DMT, dimethyltryptamine, is a component in ayahuasca. And as I also mentioned, very interestingly, DMT is a component in our spinal cord, and it's a brain chemical that's very similar to melatonin and serotonin. It's a tryptamine. It may be secreted by the pineal gland. There's a very interesting book about it called DMT, the Spirit Molecule, by Dr. Rick Straussman, which I recommend. But yeah, when you extract DMT and smoke it, you're taking something that's been kind of synthetically treated, at least in this extraction. The difference, I mean, I've never done crack, so I can't really say what crack is like, but my understanding is that's more like a sudden rush of euphoria, kind of blinding, sort of flood of pleasure to the pleasure sensors. The DMT experience is the hallucinogenic plunge into this incredibly hyper-real other reality. And you only spend a few minutes in this other reality, but it feels like a very long time. And you have the sense of these kind of super sentient entities or guardians or world makers who are kind of laughing at you and watching over you and playing with you. It's almost more than your brain can take or hold. So yeah, it's a deeply ecstatic in all senses of the term kind of experience of a different reality. I think it's very different than crack or coke or heroin.
And over time, I mean, do these substances, these medicines, are they as addictive as are street drugs?
No, none of the psychedelics are addictive at all. I mean, I've done DMT twice and would probably be happy never to take it again. So yeah, there doesn't seem to be much addictive potential for most of the psychedelic substances. I mean, there can be a psychological addiction, and I think that, once again, we have this kind of consumerist mindset. So anything that we explore, we tend to bring that mindset to, or if we get, a certain reaction, we want to go and get another reaction right after. But I think that the way that, these indigenous cultures use these substances and have used them safely for a really long time suggests that they just don't have the kind of negative ramifications of our street drugs.
Then what is different, or how are shamans oriented so differently that they might use these particular medicines over the course of time and don't end up like some crack addict, or end up like, some person whose life is crushed because of the substances that they took?
Yeah, well, you really have to discriminate between substances and have to, becoming, as I'm talking about transformation in consciousness, becoming more conscious and more intelligent requires a deeper sort of understanding of subtleties. And really, when you look at these substances, there's massive good work on it. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily trust what the government says, but there's a lot of research on psychedelics, and they're not addictive. They're not destructive. They can be misused. They can cause sort of negative episodes. They can, if people use them in unprotected situations, they can lead to people jumping out windows. I mean, that does happen. So that's why it's really interesting to think about exploring this more shamanic realm. And for me, it's like when you go into these indigenous cultures, you're actually connecting with the lineage, and that has a certain protective aspect to it also.
Sure.
So it's different than just tripping in your college campus or, at home, in a totally desacralized secular context. And it's interesting because I just feel there has been this kind of, I've noted this kind of movement of more and more people going to South America and other cultures and really seeking out these experiences and really taking in powerful teachings from them.
Well, how do you do that? I mean, do you get off a plane and ask the cab driver to take you to a shaman, or how do you begin for the average tourist? I mean, how is that sort of thing done?
Well, at this point, you probably could do that if you went to certain places in Peru and so on. But, that's really, I don't like to offer advice about this kind of material because I feel it's really, the individual has to do their own work if they want to have these experiences. When there are tour groups, there's discussion boards about San Pedro or ayahuasca. And, it's just very much a part of South American culture that hasn't been destroyed, and the mestizos have adopted it. So people have to do their own research, and there are good ways to do it, and there are also stupid ways to do it. So I would recommend that people be smart and look for the good ways.
I'm good with that. I'm totally good with that. And I non-drug user, I'm not going to run off and do it, but I am curious about how, what the if you will, the pipeline is that's set up for somebody like you to end up here you were searching for connectivity. You were trying to get away from the alienation that you were experiencing in our culture.
Well, yeah,
How do you just pick up a phone and then go to someplace like that?
Well, I did research. I'm a journalist, so I have journalist tools. But I found botanists. I mean, when I went to West Africa, I went with a South African botanist who'd been working with this tribe. I went with a botanist in Ecuador to visit this tribe. He'd been working with them. I also was working with a kind of teacher, a woman, shaman, who also was a Jungian psychoanalyst, and she'd been working with different medicine traditions. And so with her, I went down to the Santo Daime in Brazil. So yeah, I mean, I was lucky to find really, really good people who'd done their groundwork to make good relationships with these different cultures.
But typically, you're not going to be able to just call up your local travel agent.
I don't think you could do that at this point. But there are people who there are groups that are bringing people down there. I think like there's a magazine, Shaman's Drum, and they have a lot of tour kind of groups listed. So
before you had this transmission that you spoke of last hour from Quetzalcoatl, you said that you'd been thinking about, and if I wrote my notes correctly, about UFOs, like abductions and crop circles and stuff, and that had been going through your mind before that transmission?
Well, if you read the book, I studied the crop circles intensely. I spent 2 summers in England and went through a lot of ups and downs with it. Like, I had a lot of doubt about it, and I had friends who were hoaxers, and I interviewed people who really claimed that they knew everyone responsible for it, but I also talked with researchers who've been studying it for years and had absolutely evidence that they felt was absolutely convincing that they couldn't possibly be made by human beings. And some of that evidence seemed pretty good to me. I mean, there are also biophysicists who've done work on what happens to the plants and have actually published papers in peer-reviewed science journals demonstrating that there's a kind of electromagnetic energy or microwave radiation that causes these things to happen in plants that couldn't possibly be happening if people were just pushing them down with boards. So I collected a lot of material about this phenomenon and really kept going back and forth and talking to more and more people. And I ended up coming to the conclusion, which I offer in my book, that the whole phenomenon is in itself a teaching on the nature of reality. And it's a teaching that's geared specifically for the modern Western mind. And it's also a teaching that's completely synchronized with this prophetic situation we're in terms of 2012. And in fact, in the last few years, some of the most extravagantly complex and flawlessly executed crop formations have been using Mayan calendar data and patterns and Mayan kind of symbols. So there seems to be a direct relationship between this phenomenon and this transformation of consciousness.
Great. So, I mean, but again, so that was your interest in the abduction idea?
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, so when I started studying the crop formations, one of the first, in 2001, there was one that was this answer to the SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, had sent this signal into space with a little man, our DNA code, and the building blocks of life, and so on, and a sort of replica of that had come down in this field, flawlessly executed, except that instead of a man, it had kind of like a littler, big-headed alien and different DNA. So that led me on a whole exploration of this alien abduction material, which I definitely never really taken seriously before. It also, I mean, I began to have certain dream experiences related to the aliens, and just really had to think deeply about it. I think it's actually, I mean, I feel that in some ways this new book, 2012, is a serious contribution to human knowledge, and it's subtle material, and it's hard to convey in just a few minutes in a radio interview. But I think that I've come up with a perspective on this alien abduction material, which will really help people think through it rationally and get a sense of what's going on. I mean, to sum it up, and I would say it's almost like these aliens are in a sort of, from a non-dualistic framework, these entities are both projections of our psyche and have their own sort of reality, maybe on a sort of lower dimensional plane from where we are. They seem to be particularly desouled entities that the Islamic tradition talks about. They seem to be obsessed with our emotional capacities, which they lack. In a sense, I see them as a kind of bacteria or viral agent operating on the level of consciousness. And they also seem to be very connected to this prophetic shift that we're going through.
I think that's very interesting. Bacterial? Did I hear you say?
In a sense, yeah. I mean, I got very interested in William Owen Thompson idea about that there had been this. It's a lot to go into, but yeah, in a way, like a kind of a threshold experience for us to shift into this next level of consciousness. It's almost a kind of test or a barrier that we have to recognize that there are these entities from lower dimensions, other dimensions, and how they operate in our reality, and how, in a sense, it's like there's something very like there's a lot of pathos in a strange way to this alien abduction saga. I mean, just their kind of longing to commune with us, to connect with us, but also their kind of predatory malevolence. It's a very complex phenomenon, and we really need to bring our full awareness to just thinking it through and what it means about how we might be in future times in contact with different forms of consciousness than our own.
Then how do we think of them as desouled?
Well, yeah. If you read the accounts, I mean, it's interesting that a lot of times we're brought up, humans are brought up to play with their sad kind of hybrid human aliens or alien children, and they're telepathic. They don't speak. They project their thoughts. They have obviously their own weird high-level technologies and so on, but they have these blocks that this has been reported in many accounts, where when we pick up the blocks and turn them, they don't have letters and numbers on them because they don't need to learn that kind of stuff. It's all telepathic, but they actually emit different feelings as they're turned. So in a sense, it's like they're lacking this emotional body, and what they're trying to learn or regain is affect, is emotion, is the soul. And that's why they're so attracted to us. It's almost like dusty moths being attracted to heat and light.
That's the premise of the movie The Forgotten.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen that?
No, I haven't.
You might enjoy it in light of this conversation. It came out a couple of years ago with I can't think of her name, but The Forgotten, and it's sort of very very much centered in that idea of them being fascinated by us. I fear that thought of desouling, although I totally get what you're saying, only because I wonder whether that's a kind of planetism or earthism or something, or humanism, where we're looking at it as us over them. As we have souls, but they don't, and so I'm intrigued by that because I have.
Well, yeah, I mean, all I'm trying to do is, in the whole book, really, what I'm trying to do is bring into articulation things that are a little bit kind of outside of our grasp, and language is can be a kind of blunt instrument in a way, but that is the best way I've understood to kind of conceptualize what's happening here. There's a kind of lost quality to these entities, and I don't necessarily think that they are from like another planet in a literal sense. They may be more close to kind of goblins or gnomes, and there are many writers who noted the parallels between sort of alien abduction accounts and stories of people taken to the fairy world or into the kingdom of the goblins from fairy tales. It's kind of like the modern post-technological version of those experiences.
Do you see a connection between the transmission of Quetzalcoatl to you and your, your reshifting toward thinking about the times that we're in and the thoughts that you were having just before Quetzalcoatl spoke?
Right. Yeah. Well, as I said, this Quetzalcoatl transmission, it was really like I'd been collecting all of this material, and it was almost like I really began to think of consciousness in terms of kind of vibration or frequency, and it was like by doing all of this work, and I can really like hyper focus. I mean, I can be a really mess in certain ways, but I'm able to become very, very disciplined and focused. And I've just been obsessively focusing on this whole paradigm, this whole level of information, and it was like I'd sort of begun to do this self-organization process, and then it was during this ayahuasca ceremony that the whole thing was kind of crystallized and taken to a different level for me.
Well, good. Well, then, and we will take this to another level before we bring in your phone calls, too, coming up in my last segment with Daniel Pinchbeck on my own, and then you'll join the conversation coming up in our final hour. The Return of Quetzalcoatl 2012 continues on Coast to Coast AM in for Art. My name's Ian Punnett. So, Coast to Coast Live is ordinarily heard before Coast to Coast AM on Saturday nights. If you are unable to catch Coast to Coast Live in your town, you can always sign up for a stream link online at Coast to Coast am.com. And while you're there, you can go back and listen to the archive shows on MP3. Just download those and enjoy them. We've had so many good ones. And in fact, this was going to be one of those. Until we got the word that said Art needed one more night off at least, and so I jumped in and wanted very much to keep the conversation going with Daniel Pinchbeck. I've been enjoying the book 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, and you will join the conversation coming up in the final hour. I want to return back to some things he's been talking about, and I keep making these notes, and then I make more notes. I got more notes, and I know what to do with in here, but I really like where he's going. Let's go more, though, in terms of what we need to do to be ready for this number, even though we're not looking at that year perhaps as literally as some. What should we be doing to change ourselves? I know Daniel says he tries to avoid being prescriptive, but there's a couple of parts in the book that I really want to go back to in terms of what it says that we're doing wrong. What might we be doing better or more right? Coming up next on Coast to Coast AM. In for Art, this is Ian. So, you okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Just to sum up where we are with this, 2012, you're not encouraging us to take literally.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm offering the thought experiment and looking at these other thinkers who've been working with this material, and I definitely think there's something powerful and profound here. But I think that the crux of the matter is going to come before 2012, and that's also in this Carl Johan Kalaman work on the calendar. That 2008 he proposes might be a kind of socioeconomic crisis, and it might be that in working through that crisis that we then form this like new level of consciousness, which would almost have to be embodied in new kind of social institutions and structures.
I get the theory of that, but how might we really be talking about that getting played out, where we have a massive unemployment, or are we talking about a kind of cataclysm of some sort in our, in war, or our economy crashes? What are you talking about?
Yeah, well, we may get some of that. I mean, for me, I think that one problem we really have right now is that we have a very negative imagination about and very fear-based feelings about things that could happen. We don't really use our imagination positively to envision the kind of society that we could create or maybe should create. And we have thinkers like Buckminster Fuller who talked about creating like a kind of post-work culture. If you think about work and the way people work now, I mean, most of that work is not necessarily beneficial to the environment or to the planet. It's not even necessarily helping with the basic support systems that people need. I mean, I talk about Herbert Marcuse, talked about, we've created this culture that is obsessed with false needs, and has this kind of fear-based energy. So, yeah, I mean, maybe if we used our imagination more positively, we could begin to pull in a different kind of reality into manifestation. And as I said, I told you that the crop circles were a teaching on the nature of reality for me. And part of that realization was that how important our intention is and how important it is where we put the focus of our consciousness. And if we keep focusing on negative outcomes and negative possibilities, we're kind of drawing those closer to realization. So, yeah, I would think that we need to first have a kind of really positive vision of what a human sort of harmonic global planetary culture could be like. And then we can begin to manifest that in different ways.
I met Buckminster Fuller once. I was in 7th grade. It was totally cool. I didn't know who he. I mean, we were given this crash course on who he was. He was coming to our school, and so we had to learn about him. We saw a film on it. But I mean, for years later, I wish I knew then what I know now about Buckminster Fuller. I'd have so many better questions for him than, do your friends call you Bucky or something?
Right. Well, he talked about creating. I mean, it was only 3 billion people at that point, but creating a world of 3 billion millionaires, where you'd actually be paying people for the most part not to work. We'd want to encourage them to be in their home communities and make sure they had enough food and could kind of engage in creative projects. I mean, really, since the 1950s, this kind of work culture that we've instituted is a little bit of a unreality or a delusion, or or kind of a bad trip that we're on as a society. Because clearly, with industrialization, we could have really created a much more kind of leisure society.
Is that when you think it started?
Well, I think that was there's been major junctures all along, but that was one major opportunity. I mean, this is according to Marcuse, to really rethink the thrust of the civilization and begin to turn it in a different direction.
I totally chime with that idea of a fear-based kind of economy and the way in which we think about our economy and preparing for disaster. I find myself prone to that all the time, and I catch myself doing it because I'm afraid of what's on the other side. But at the same time, too, I think, well, what if it's better? And how do we make that jump into something that could be better when, as you said earlier, some people in this culture are very afraid of death because they are enjoying life so much, or they don't know what's on the other side, and so we're having such a good time here. I think
are we having such a good time?
Well, I do think I think we're very pleasure oriented, and I mean, I was actually having a conversation with somebody the other day who moved to not far from me, and they were talking about where they came from, and they were surprised at how entertainment oriented this culture that they moved into, this state culture that they moved into, is that everybody has all these toys, and there's a lot of winter toys and summer toys, and it's a very recreationally minded community. Now, I happen to like that, but it was interesting. She said, I'm not used to that. I'm not used to people recreating all the time and always being focused on playing a game or having some sort of outdoor activity.
Right. I mean, I would say we've become a bit possessed by our possessions. I mean, I'm very interested in the book, I look at various mythological archetypes, and according to the Hindus, we're in the Kali Yuga, which is the fourth age. There was a kind of golden age, silver age, bronze age, and this is the iron age, which is the age of materialism and destruction. And Kali represents the kind of wrathful manifestation of Shakti, which is the deity that represents kind of feminine sexual energy. Who's the consort of Shiva, who represents kind of the masculine principle of consciousness and order and discipline. So, I got interested in this idea of materialism. If you look at the root of that word, it's mater, which is mother. So in a sense, we could see this kind of materialism as a relationship to the negative aspects of the mother as kind of possessive, aggrieved, devouring, rather than generous and giving. So it's like we sort of need to shift our perspective on our relationship to materiality and to all these possessions that in a way maybe have kind of possessed us.
Well, how do we say that at the same time recommend to people that they buy and own your book?
I just want them to read the book. I don't really care about ownership. Cause I think
so if they don't
I think that the book will actually help them have a different perspective on the situation we're in.
So if they don't buy it, that's okay with you, just as long as they read it.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly nice for me to, be able to survive as a person. But what really interests me is getting these ideas into the culture. And I feel very grateful to you and to Coast for letting me yap away about this stuff.
Well, you're not yapping. It's very interesting. And pardon me for yanking your chain on that a little bit. So if we look at the 2012 part of your title as being more like, okay, from 2008 to 2012, and maybe not so much literally a year, but a period, how do we look at the return of Quetzalcoatl? Is the same sort of archetypal kind of divinity, more symbolic, or do you think that something is going to happen?
Well, I think something is already happening. I mean, it's certainly happening in my life and to a lot of people that I know. I mean, part of what I talk about is this necessary shift in the nature of time. Like, we have this very kind of like future-oriented mentality, and I think we actually need to come a little more into kind of the here and nowness of reality, and I look at that in various perspectives, including looking at the Aboriginals, which the word literally means of the origin, and how for them, like, every day is the first day. There's never like a fall or degradation. They're in a different relationship to reality. And I think we need to come back to a little of that perspective. We need to be more in the now. But for me, Quetzalcoatl really represents this fusion of knowledge systems, which would be this merge of this intuitive, shamanic, lunar, certain sense feminine system of thought and being with our modern, rational, scientific, technological mindset. And I think it's in that fusion that we create this new form of consciousness, which will lead to a different relationship to the planet and will actually allow us to clean up the mess that we've made at this point.
Are there Mayans that believe, or for that matter, are there modern inheritors of the Mayan tradition that believe in a physical return of Quetzalcoatl?
You mean like I don't really think so. I mean, what came through for me in this transmission was that I was an avatar or embodiment of Quetzalcoatl, but that doesn't mean that I'm the only one. What it is really a kind of a form of consciousness, or a kind of level of consciousness, or a kind of openness to both sides of this equation of the intuitive and the mystical and the sort of rational, empirical, technological. So I think it really represents this fusion, which creates this new consciousness.
You've mentioned the apocalypse, and of course we ordinarily associate that with a Judeo-Christian worldview on revelation, on the idea of God. There's some sort of cataclysmic event in a divine sense of good and evil, and yet you are not a dualist, as if I keep going back to that thing you've mentioned a few times. So how does this sort of thing, you mentioned you have a couple of biblical references in here, how does this track with a biblical understanding of the world?
No, I think it's perfectly in alignment. I mean, that really shocked me. I mean, it's funny because, I used to be, as I said, a secular materialist journalist, and now, in certain respects, I kind of agree more with the kind of fundamentalist recognition that we're entering, or we're already in, this kind of apocalyptic framework than I do with kind of the secular materialist perspective that couldn't possibly be happening. However, I think that their relationship to this idea is a little bit kind of atavistic. They're kind of believing that just belief in the Christ is enough to kind of ensure your salvation. For me, it's more that what Christ is doing is embodying a kind of way of being where you act from this sort of higher self perspective, this ethical level, and also this kind of immanent level where you act in the present to bring about the best possible world.
Well, I want to go with that a little bit more. So, in that sense, when you're talking about fundamentalists, which often are spoken of as in a very dismissive tone when people talk about fundamentalism or fundamentalist, what you're getting to, and I enjoyed this part of the book actually, is that fundamentalism, I think, at its core, is always a reaction to complications, to things that get so difficult. It's so hard to understand. It's so hard to sort out. It's so overwhelming that our response is to pull back to something which is much more easy to understand and to experience and to pass on. And it gets us out of the complication of, particularly of modernity. And so I saw that parallel too in what you were talking about, that rejection of the artifices of modernity, and how you were living your life in that cocktail crowd, as you spoke about earlier. And so I can totally see that. So what do you think then we could expect? I mean, here you have if you're going to use the Christian fundamentalist perspective, it's some kind of war that's coming. It's going to be a major event, and then good will come.
Maybe it's a dance, not a war.
Okay. But I mean, there's something big conflict, and then the good will come out of it. The good will be on the other side, but it will be an upheaval. And so I guess
it's already an upheaval, wouldn't you say?
Well, tell me what you mean by that.
Well, just think about, your own existence and the whole system that we're in. I mean, we're plunged into these wars all over the planet. We're all going after the last resources. I mean, the oil is depleting. Water resources are depleting. There's 10% fish left in the ocean. I mean, we're done with this paradigm. It can't take us any further. So clearly, we're going to have to make a large scale shift in our relationship to the planet and one another. It's our only hope. It's our only way.
Well, see, and I saw the story, I don't know if you saw it, about the guy who's invented a car engine that gets 8,000 miles to the gallon. And he's entering it into one of these competitions, one of these academic competitions or something where they've offered a prize for the most efficient engine. And he looks like, hands down, he's going to be the winner at 8,000 miles per gallon. Now, whether that's a practical car yet for our culture, I don't know, but it's... I
think we have to be really careful. It's like this the Wired magazine kind of consciousness where there's always this technological fix around the corner.
Right.
And for me, that's mainly, it might be nice if something comes along, but that's a little bit delusionary. For me, it's really about this, once we've made this more like profound turning around in perspective, we may find a lot of what we need is already here and available. And some of it may be techniques of bioremediation, organic farming, sort of reconnecting ourselves with communities, with the land, with the local topology, which is all stuff that the indigenous cultures kind of point towards.
Well, I'd like to think that's true, but just to finish that point, I actually see things like that engine coming at a time when 2 pages earlier in the same article, newspaper I was reading, an article that said we're running out of oil, it's coming down to, and I think, you know what, something like this comes along and it delays the need. Suddenly we look like we're going to have to reshift everything. We're going to have to start, living our lives differently in our relationship to oil. And then that comes along. And suddenly it's like, oh, I guess, if that was realistic, that pushes off the timeline. That pushes off any kind of, drop dead date by which we have to have things fixed. And I don't know that that's a good thing. I'm not saying it is, but it's interesting how sometimes that's just how it feels. It's just when it feels like we're getting to a boiling point, it's like another valve will open and suddenly it releases the pressure and we don't end up boiling over.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, that would be nice to think so. But when you look at these sort of cofactors, I talked about this book, God's Last Offer by Ed Ayers from World Watch. And, we have the carbon gas emissions, we have population, we have really the species extinction is probably the most distressing and sort of inescapable thing that's happening right now. 25% of all species are apparently going to be extinct in the next 30 years. And what really happens then is, we don't even know if the biosphere sustains itself because we were learning as we go that the sort of intermeshed web of life is a deeply complex and interrelated system, right?
Sure.
So, a lot of people, scientists and so on, are saying that we really have about 5 years to make a massive shift in our behavior patterns.
Well, why isn't that part of that fear-based outlook?
Oh, well, because I think that it's going to be a better situation once we make that shift. I really don't think that people are, for the most part, particularly happy in this system. I think that they're having this domination by this kind of fear and anxiety mentality. And that's why, for me, it's like unless you get this psychic and mystical and sort of esoteric piece of the puzzle, you're kind of stuck. You're kind of nowhere. But it's only when you begin to pull that into your consciousness and into your awareness, then the whole thing begins to make sense. And you have a whole different perspective on what's possible.
Very good. Well, what a good place to stop then for your questions and your contributions into the conversation on the book 2012. A clever cover, by the way, very subtle connection between crop circles and Quetzalcoatl on the front. The Return of Quetzalcoatl, 2012. Where would you go with this? You'll have your chance with Daniel Pinchbeck next on Coast to Coast AM. In for Art Bell, this is Ian Punnett. Thank you, Mr. Ross. 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl. the book by Daniel Pinchbeck. It's his latest. And I enjoyed, Daniel, quite a bit the part here where you were talking about Rosicrucian Christianity, especially in light of this week's release of the Da Vinci Code movie, which gets people talking about that period where it seemed like Christianity was heading in one direction and then suddenly it went elsewhere. But you talk about that a little bit in terms of its alchemical context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it seemed like the Rosicrucians were very sophisticated kind of alchemists who saw this possibility of restoring kind of a initiation culture to Christianity, initiation like a shamanic initiation or like the Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece, which were a yearly event where people would go and have this direct revelation of the sacred, perhaps using a psychedelic potion. So yeah, the Rosicrucians were trying to bring back this kind of occult element, and they weren't allowed to do it at that time.
And yet in the same area, later on, you have the birthplace of LSD.
Yeah, well, I think LSD definitely has an incredibly fascinating history. And when I did some research on it, I learned about how Albert Hofmann, the Swiss chemist, had synthesized it in Basel in 1938. And first of all, Basel is the medieval center of alchemy. It's where Paracelsus taught for a while and so on. So anyway, he synthesized it and then forgot about it. It didn't work. They were working with ergot fungus, which midwives used. They were looking for a muscle contractant, and it didn't serve that purpose. And he forgot about it, and he did hundreds of other chemicals. Then 5 years later, in 1943, he suddenly had started having dreams about this particular chemical, LSD, and felt compelled to resynthesize it, and then accidentally took the first LSD trip, and then a week later took the first intentional LSD trip. And when you look what was happening in Europe at that point, when he took the first intentional LSD trip, it was almost exactly the same date, or I think it was the same week, where the Nazis were doing the street-by-street cleaning out of the Warsaw Ghetto, and the street fighting was taking place, and that uprising against the Nazis from the Jews. And for me, there's some deep potential relationship between LSD and Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. I believe that ergot was discussed in the Kabbalah, and it was a substance that also was used by medieval witches.
I thought it was interesting that you were tying in the creation of LSD into another, period of tumult, the 60s. And I thought it was interesting that Albert Hofmann was pretty close to the name Abbie Hoffman.
Yeah, well, actually, my mother edited Abbie Hoffman's first book in '68, Revolution for the Hell of It. I have some early childhood memories of him coming to visit our house.
How do your parents think of this sort of, as you were resistant to the word conversion, but this transformation into a more, I don't know whether you want to say religious worldview, but I mean, definitely.
I wouldn't say religious, but I would definitely say mystical.
Mystical, spiritual.
Well, my dad died a few years ago. In fact, while I was working on the first book, so I never really had the chance to discuss it with him. But for my mother, it's been a kind of a process where I think that she's, at least she's very much of a materialist. She's a writer. She was involved with the Beat Generation in the 50s and has written memoirs and novels and so on. And it's really been a struggle for her to understand that I was taking this kind of mystical material seriously. But I think she's accepted it and is at least interested in the whole trajectory.
Let's get a bunch of callers on for you. Coming up next, joining the conversation with Daniel Pinchbeck for the rest of this hour. The book is 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Everybody wants to get in on the conversation. Let's start with Justin, west of the Rockies, for Daniel Pinchbeck on Coast to Coast AM. Justin, you're talking with Daniel.
Pleasure as always, Ian.
Thank you.
And great show, Daniel. I wanted to make a kind of a comment or a point that I think it is really great for people to be open to this kind of spiritual kind of thing, and unfortunately, because of the way, drugs are viewed in our society, a lot of people either don't have access or, wouldn't seek access to that means of gaining knowledge of that other spiritual side of ourselves. But I think if people open their mind up to that kind of thing and just pay attention to the little things. I mean, every single day I notice just small coincidences and just little things here and there that go on that kind of give you clues that there's some more kind of an underlying spiritual thing going on, something going on, other more than meets the eye to life.
Okay.
And then I was curious if you had listened to anything that Ed Dames had to say, especially about what you were saying about crop circles, that he, that they're who they're made by, and that he's actually says that he can predict now, him and his remote viewing team can predict when they're supposed to be formed, not the ones that are hoaxes or made by humans, but the next actual genuine crop circles.
All right, let's Daniel, what do you think about that, Daniel?
First of all, I thought his first point was really good. I don't think that, I don't really, want to even advocate psychedelics. I think there's a lot of ways to get to these other levels of perception and really just being more conscious and more aware of what's happening, these kind of tactile hints and clues that sometimes we get. I think that's a good point. And I don't know Ed Danes' work on crop circles. I do know that there are people who, say that with remote viewers or psychic help they can predict them or be in communication with the crop circle makers. I heard a nice story about this guy who was researching it, went to a psychic channel who then channeled the crop circle makers, and he asked them, so what do you think of human beings? And the crop circle makers answered, why, we think you're hilarious. Basically, they see us kind of as like bumbling around, like sort of Laurel and Hardy characters in an old silent movie that we just can't quite get it together yet.
Thanks, Justin. And let me ask you, though, Daniel, what are some of those other ways, then, that people can access this without drugs?
Well, certainly meditation, yoga. I think there's a we've seen this huge surge of popularity of different Eastern disciplines. There's also shamanic techniques that don't require substances. There's drum circles, but really, ritualized, intensified drumming, where that's part of a means to attain altered consciousness. There's also holotropic breath work, which is a really amazing modality, just using the breath to attain visionary states.
And good old spinning around in the front yard.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Mike on the wild card line. Hey, Mike, you're talking with Daniel Pinchbeck on Coast to Coast AM.
Good evening, Daniel, and the Ianator.
Yes, thank you.
Daniel, we missed you when Graham Hancock visited New York promoting Supernatural last November.
Yeah, for some reason I couldn't make it. I think I might have been out of town or something, but I'd still love to meet him, definitely.
A spiritual teacher, Barry Long, his core message is to stop thinking. This is to be in the moment like an athlete in the zone. John Lash, a guest that's been on the show, says that the Gnostics called the aliens the archons, and Lash says the archons manifest through our thinking mind. He said the Gnostics warned against thought-based stories called religions that could lend towards competition, and to either remote view or even feel your heartbeat. We've heard that quieting the mind will help cultivate this inner awareness. So, Daniel, I've had strangers in our local metaphysical bookstore say it's actually impossible to stop their thinking. And I feel this exemplifies possibly your psychic blockade. People wanting, I'm almost done, people wanting a bigger house and a newer car want to be told that aliens and crop circles are hoaxes so that their message, that any message won't conflict with the message of thinking about what they want to get, that they have going on in their head like a mantra all the time. So I can't see how more cleverer thinking is going to get us out of this robotic mindset without a seriously directed personal experience for everyone's edification.
Right.
Your feeling, please.
Yeah, I disagree with you in a sense, because I think that to reject thinking to me would be regressive, I really, Rudolf Steiner is somebody I talk a lot in my book, and I'm really interested in his conception that thinking is a spiritual path, and that's what it is for me. I think that, thinking is very much part of our Western tradition and part of our philosophical tradition, and actually we need to apply thinking and more cogently and more deeply to our situation on many levels. So for me, thinking is a spiritual path, and I think it's an honorable one.
I wonder, he's making an interesting connection between thinking and obsessing over the construct of a bigger house, a faster car. And I can see why he makes that connection, but I don't know what we do with, Descartes and his reality model of I think, therefore I am. I think to some degree we have to acknowledge that we are who we are, and we know who we are because we can think it to a degree. It doesn't mean that it has to go all the way to, the kind of ultra-materialism that makes us obsessed with thinking and creating constantly all day long. I think there's a way of turning it off or turning it down without turning it off, maybe a better phrase.
Yeah, well, also I think there's there is some elements of necessity in this understanding of this intuitive kind of mind, and that, or it's not even really in the mind. It's a sort of this intuition, which is this kind of flash of insight that comes from like another domain, and that there's something about resting in that intuitive zone, which is absolutely necessary,
right,
and requires a kind of its own kind of discipline to learn how to do.
But you can rest in it. You don't have to be active in it. But it doesn't mean you're not thinking. You're just resting in your thoughts.
Yeah, I think for me it's really like it's a little bit like the ego. We just have to have a different perspective of the ego. A lot of people sort of think about to become spiritual, you want to get rid of the ego or lose the ego. But for me, the ego is a necessary element. So it's not about losing the ego, it's attaining the state of ego freedom, where you recognize the limitations of the ego, that it's a kind of lens, and all the thinking that goes along with having that ego is part of your constituency. But it's not something to reject. It's just not to see it as the be-all and end-all.
It can be its own kind of comedy.
Exactly.
Wildcard line, Tara for Daniel Pinchbeck on Coast to Coast AM.
Yes, pardon. Good evening, gentlemen. Good to hear your voice, Eon. A fascinating program. Keep up the good work, Daniel. A point of clarification, a comment, and, the points that I'd like them to touch over for the rest of the morning.
Well, you may not get all of those in, so be careful to choose the ones you really want.
When you said you haven't taken any drugs, I think you meant you've taken antibiotics at some point. I think what you meant is you haven't taken any plant medicines, because the classic definition of a drug is what comes over the prescription pad. But the larger point that I want to make is that it seems that there's something missing in all of this, and what it seems to be is what somebody like Tim Weiss or Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, or more recently Gabriel Oyibo, Oyaibo. I think he actually has a mathematical equation. What seems to be missing is the fact that we're dealing with a European supremacy in terms of the world view, and I think that's something that I know. Greg Braden was recently with Lisa, and he mentioned about the fact that the library in Alexandria was burnt down. That had to happen, and I think that's left out of discussion. But
okay, well, about jump ahead to a question. I think you were because we just trying to get everybody in. Tara.
I want him to speak about Terence McKenna and Krishnamurti, because Krishnamurti, in a recent book I read, not a recent book, but I just finished reading recently, Freedom from the Unknown. He says, stop the thinking so that the conditioning stops. I'd like him to speak on how he's been influenced.
Let's give him that chance to do that. Okay, go ahead.
Cool. Yeah, I haven't really been influenced that much by Krishnamurti. I read some of his books years ago, and I kind of forgot about him. Terence McKenna is definitely a huge influence. But as I said before, I think that directed thinking is part of a spiritual path, and the idea that we can sort of jump into okay, so for instance, it's like if we're talking about a transformation in consciousness, that means we have to bring more consciousness to bear on everything that's going on. And for me, that requires some serious thinking.
Let's go east of the Rockies, where Peter is waiting for Daniel Pinchbeck. Peter, I'm about to institute a 1-minute preamble rule. Everybody gets 1 minute of preamble before their question, but we're going to limit it to just 1 minute.
Okay, Ian. Hi, Daniel Pinchbeck. This is Peter from Dearborn Heights. I've triangulated the end times by 3 prophets without no spiritualism, and I'm an edifying prophet.
Okay.
And basically Nostradamus in Century 10, Quatrain 74, he said, "The ear of the great seventh number revolved."
Okay.
And basically, so that means 207 probably. It will appear at the time of the games. Now, just remember the word "it" of the hectocomb. Not this is from the great millennium, which is 2000. So now we've got the year 2007.
Okay.
And so basically, now if you go to the word "it," if you go to Daniel, and it waxed great, even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host of the stars to the ground,
okay,
and stamped on them. So therefore, it's saying that extraterrestrials have been shot down by us, and it is the beast.
And that last part of the triangle was?
And the last part is John in Revelations, where he also in Daniel it tells you that this here man that magnifies.
No, we're already in Revelation. Well,
let's finish Daniel. He lasted
no. Let's finish this.
300 days, which is 6 years, 3 months.
Okay, I understand.
Now you go to Revelations, and you've got chapter 11 of Revelations, and this here.
You're over my 1 minute rule. See, you agreed to a 1 minute preamble,
okay, well,
then you just kept on going.
Well, I'm sorry. Yeah,
okay.
It's very tough to get through. You know what I mean?
I know, but I feel like this is very selfish of you because there really isn't a question in here yet for our guest.
The thing is, I just want to see if he agrees with me that he is a spiritualist. He believes. Is he a Christian?
I don't think so, but go ahead. Daniel, does that make sense to you, that kind of the kind of triangulation?
Well, yeah, I mean, I just, for some reason, I've never really vibed in Nostradamus. I just can't really go there personally. Maybe it's really important, but for me, it's just I also had to sort of limit my investigation at a certain point, and I sort of chose my angles in a sense. So yeah, I get a little sort of leery of kind of literalization in certain respects. So yeah, I don't quite know what else to say about that.
Okay, but I mean, the idea of looking at things that do come together, that is sort of intriguing because I think some people would say that Nostradamus also thought and also spoke about in terms of 2012, and so that's not I mean, if that's true, that's kind of a cool, if nothing else, coincidence.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, for me, I really got, when I went through all of this investigation, I got very interested in Nietzsche's kind of looking at truth as not being necessarily like there's a singular, unified, ultimate truth. That truth might be more like a system of values, like a painter uses values in a painting.
Sure.
So just a different perspective, like rather than trying to find this one ultimate theory that fits everything.
I'm glad to have people come in with their points of view, but if it's not really a question for Peter, a question for Daniel, I hope we can just keep those comments shorter so that we can get to all these people who do want to talk and do want to ask Daniel a question. I want to get involved in that coming up. I mean, it's important that you get your point in, but also let's make that be a point for everybody and not just grabbing the microphone when you get a chance, because we want to make this a conversation, not just a series of lectures. And 2012, the return of Quetzalcoatl will return next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. I disavow any connection to that bumper, by the way. I still shudder at the thought that poor Gene Kelly was involved in the production of that movie. Coming up, more with Daniel Pinchbeck and your comments and your questions. Looking forward to more of the latter in particular. And joining the conversation here, there's so much rich material that I just I hate to waste it. And so Daniel Pinchbeck coming up next, and you, hang on, we'll go first-time caller line and then international, and then wherever you're going to take us next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Thinking about the year 2012 and what is building up to it with Daniel Pinchbeck. And John is on the first-time caller line for Daniel. Go ahead, John.
Hey, y'all. Y'all are very dynamic in both of y'all's perspective, but I have a question for Daniel, and it is, how does he know he's not riding a dead Quetzalcoatl?
Yeah, I don't know. That's good. That's a wonderful question. I mean, basically, like, I feel like I've been on this 10-year kind of journey, and it kept opening up, and this story kept unfolding, and I used all of the, kind of means at my disposal to understand what was going on. But, it's open to the reader, and it's open to doubt, and in a sense, the proof is going to be in the pudding. And, if everything is going according, if the system is still rocking along, and somehow all these predictions are wrong, and I'll adjust. I'll be a laughing stock. But hey, that's life.
Actually, that's called disconfirmation, and it's a word that's often used and discussed in religious history. Disconfirmation, and so many of the biggest religious movements had a period that an epoch, some age that they were going for, and then when it didn't happen, then they do readjust and they kind of reorient themselves around the reality that they were wrong, and yet they still survive somehow. So what would be that time? What would be that year where you start to think, maybe I was wrong?
I don't know. We'll just see how it plays out. I mean, basically, as I said, for me, I've confirmed this kind of mystical understanding of reality.
Right.
And one thing I've figured out is that the world is a great work of art. And God is not only a great artist, but he has an incredibly good sense of humor. So, however I can, sort of envision how things might turn out, I'm sure it's going to be both more aesthetically interesting and funnier than I can possibly imagine.
Well, I love that idea. But if it's 2016 and we're all still driving SUVs and nothing's really changed all that much?
Well, I really don't think that that's possible. I mean, unfortunately, just when you look fundamentally at the level, the sort of rate of change that's happening on the planet, and the negative effects of our rush towards globalization. I mean, when China and India, gear up and get into the picture, there just ain't going to be anything left. So, somehow those of us who are at the leading edge of culture and consciousness have to make that shift first, and then it can transfer across the planet, one hopes.
International line, Roz is hanging on for Daniel Pinchbeck. Go ahead, Roz.
Hi, this is Roz from Canada. I was just wondering if, after your higher consciousness experiences here, if this has changed you on a daily basis. Like, have you had any Kundalini experiences or Siddhi or psychic experiences that you're now having, like, on a regular daily basis? Has it opened it up for you?
Great question.
Yeah, I mean, I would say so, although I haven't really pursued that. I mean, what I've actually been pursuing is almost in the opposite direction. Like, I've been starting a new company, which is called Evolver. There's actually a website for it, evolverproject.com. And almost it was like, having understood all this stuff, it seemed almost like the most shamanic thing I could do was almost the most practical thing I could do, and actually try to start a company that would address these issues. Create a business plan. That was a very shamanic act for me. It was like thinking about corporate reality.
Yeah.
Because for me, it's like if the globalization and this industrial, post-industrial corporate culture is what's the greatest poison on the planet. In alchemy, the way you transform poison is you turn poison into medicine. So it's so poisonous because it's so efficient. So the question is, can we use that same model of this corporate culture, but use it to create a positive vision of the future and actually tools and techniques for transforming the reality that we're in. And that's what we're trying to sort of come up with Evolver.
So don't hire a consultant, hire a wizard?
Well, I mean, of course, I was cracking wise about the wizard, but
well, I meant that. I didn't mean that to be disrespectful at all. I actually think that's a great idea. I mean, what you're saying is you're asking for an otherwise sort of traditional business hierarchy to think outside of their box, and you're the guy that's going to. I mean, am I asking? Are they going to bring you in to force themselves out of their comfort zone?
Well, I would imagine. I mean, I think that, I like the name Evolver, I think, is very significant because it's like anybody who comes into the field of this company or in the field of these ideas that I'm representing, I think is being forced into a kind of questioning and evolutionary and potentially transformational process. So that's what I feel like I'm sort of embodying in a sense now.
But what will they get for their money is what I'm really coming down to, is what if they hire you?
Oh, well, we're in this company, we're planning to make money. We have this whole plan to do a kind of media and membership organization, sort of on the model of National Geographic or AARP for retired people, but actually about consciousness, ecologically sustainable business, alternative energy, really trying to plug people into a whole new paradigm and then creating a membership program where we can use the social network abilities of the internet to sort of help a kind of shift in consciousness.
Very cool. Thank you. Wildcard line, Jim for Daniel Pinchbeck on Coast to Coast AM. Jim?
Hey, good hanging out with you guys tonight.
And you.
Hey, anyway, I believe everything has a spiritual side, every day. But I've been hearing about this new religion. It's supposed to be coming out of this country, America, in the next couple of years. And I was wondering if you could comment on that, if you've heard anything about that. And I think that all religions have something in common. If they could just agree on these certain key things.
Well, help me understand what you mean when you say a new religion is coming out. You make it sound like a new album coming out or something.
Well, I heard it on George Norrie the other night. It's
right.
One of the predictions, and something's supposed to be coming out. Is it really a new religion, or is it just simply, do you believe, just a revival of something very old and ancient? And I always take your comment off there.
Okay, good.
Cool. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, for me, I'm hoping that the new religion will be like the religion of common sense. Like just people kind of a kind of awakening process on an individual and a collective level, sort of a collective level. I mean, there's a way that like we've been a little bit zombified by this culture we're in with all of its entertainments and distractions and so on, and we're really going to have to pull ourselves up and make a deeper, kind of attempt to understand the situation we're in on all these different levels and then address it. Because these changes seem to be upon us and they seem to be coming faster.
Wouldn't it be really disappointing if the new religion was all built around a love of like Topher Grace or like some actor or actress of the day or something? I mean, we get to this great big thing, and so often, as you point out in the book, we end up going for the trivial, just as we just seem so focused on that. I would love to think that we'll get something big out of it, but I'm skeptical.
Mm-hmm.
Wildcard line, Kelly is on for Daniel Pinchbeck on Coast to Coast AM. Kelly?
Hi. I have a question for Daniel. I was wondering if he was aware of the correlation between mental illness and mystical experiences.
Great question.
Mental illness and mystical experiences? Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that in our culture, a lot of stuff that for shamanic cultures represented kind of access to higher consciousness or other consciousness ends up leading to mental institutions. I mean, if you think about like Black Elk Speaks, the Lakota medicine man, he'd had all these visions when he was a kid and out-of-body experiences. And, if that had been in our culture, he would have been given Thorazine and wrapped up. But in the Lakota tribe, they actually acted out all of these visions and saw them as very important to the future of the tribe. So there's kind of a different orientation to these kind of experiences and even things that we would associate with schizophrenia or psychoses. And my understanding is that in a lot of indigenous cultures that have kind of preserved their old ways, there's a much lower level of mental illness than we experience in our culture.
Does that speak to your question, Kelly?
Yeah, well, I was calling because I had what was labeled as a psychotic episode 4 years ago. And I've come to realize that it was a spiritual episode. And when I was in the hospital, right after my episode, I was looking around and I was like, wait a minute, all these people have experienced a spiritual episode, but the doctors weren't addressing it, and, they were just labeling us sick, which I believe that, we're more sensitive and, we're picking up information and may not understand what's going on. So I'm not saying that, we shouldn't take medication, because being more sensitive, can make you stay up longer and, make you kind of lose track of things. So the medication I take helps me sleep and, kind of keeps me on that peaceful level. But
what time is it where you are?
Well, it's late because I'm actually it's almost 2 a.m. I'm usually not up this late, but I'm making donation cans for a peace rally tomorrow.
Oh, good.
So,
well, we're glad to have you.
Yeah, totally. I agree with you. And I think if we were in more traditional cultures, people would be recognized as having these kind of dispositions or dispensations. There would be kind of training programs to help them develop their skills.
I was thinking about that the other day in a different context. I was thinking about St. Francis of Assisi and how, similarly in today's society, he would be, bound and gagged or heavily drugged, or he would, if he were going through, especially coming out of a certain amount of affluence, there might be courts involved in taking away his rights and all sorts of things. You couldn't do what St. Francis did in the Middle Ages today and not have societal ramifications for it. But at the same time, in the Middle Ages, even just a lot of common family practice medicine might have got you burned at the stake. So it kind of all depends on what time you're born in, and what happens to you is as much sort of indicative of the time as it is what you do with it. West of the Rock, I keep getting crickets from you, Daniel. I'm sorry about that. I don't mean to derail you from where you're going. West of the Rockies, Mazatzin for Daniel Pinchbeck.
Yes, this is Mazatzin. How you doing?
Mazatzin, go ahead.
It's nice to talk to both of you. I really appreciate this program.
Thank you.
I'm calling because you asked a question to Daniel, who I want to congratulate him for his work that he's doing and his enthusiasm in trying to find the truth. You asked him a question regarding, do the descendants or the original peoples, do you think they have something to do or think this way about Quetzalcoatl? And his answer wasn't quite covering of everything that exists out here, okay? My name is Mazatzin. That's my indigenous name that I received through ceremony because of my work that I'm doing, which is specifically the study of Quetzalcoatl. Now, I'd just like to say a couple of things, but I know I don't want to take too much time, and I do want to get my point across, and that is this. On June the 8th of 2004, the Venus Transit, that was the return of Quetzalcoatl, the Venus Transit. It was something that is carved on a little green man that is in a Stuttgart Museum in Germany, and on his body is all these dates carved on him. And that Venus passage is carved on his back. And on his front is what we call the mashplat, which the Aztec dancer used to cover their loins. On that front is a sign of one eagle. And that was the day on the Aztec calendar system that Venus rose as the morning star. Now, he will return again. His transits are 8 years apart, so he'll return again in 2012. When this happened, it was the year called 5 Flint on the ancient Mexica chronological system that we know as the Aztec calendar, on the year 5 Flint.
Let me jump in and ask you, so you're saying we're in the age of Quetzalcoatl right now?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
And do you anticipate a physical return of Quetzalcoatl?
Yes, because Quetzalcoatl, my friend, is not that the very special person, Seacatl Quetzalcoatl, that was born in Tula of the Toltec. But Quetzalcoatl is Venus as the morning star, like he is today. We call him Tlahuizcalpantecutli. And as the evening star, we call him Xolotecutli, means the companion of the sun. That's why they call him Quetzalcoatl, means precious twin. But the concept of Quetzalcoatl, it means that you, my friend, and Daniel, and everybody around me is my precious twin, my precious companion. So if I make you precious, it makes me precious. So it's the knowledge of myself. So we are in a time of 8 years that has been given to us, and he's very right on what he's saying all along of what he's coming up with, that we need to get in order. We need to get things in order because we need to get to the realization that we are all the same. We're all identical the same. We're made of the same elements that give us life.
Daniel, do you have...
Yes.
So, Daniel, do you have a question you want to ask?
No, I totally. I'm vibing on what he's saying. I think that's a very beautiful way to discuss this whole situation. In the book, I discuss the Venus transits a little bit, and just also how they represent this incredibly harmonic relationship between Venus and Earth. That there are these Venus transits every 243 years, and that in those 243 Earth years, exactly 365 days will have passed on Venus, because Venus turns much slower than the Earth. So, and that's obviously the number of days in our year. So there's some deep symmetry in the relationship between Venus and the Earth, and with a lot of phi-based relationships, which really suggests that somehow, even because phi is so basic to the proportions of life and living systems and plant growth and so on, that what we think of as life really is extending beyond this planet, that it's somehow like a phenomenon embedded in the structure of the solar system or even the galaxy. So I think those are the kind of lessons that we're beginning to open up to and learn to right now, or relearn. You know?
Well, Zatzin, my precious twin, what do you think will happen in 2012?
Okay, well, let me put it this way. What's going on here is actually the Venus transits are not that far apart. They're approximately 105 years, and then they return again 8 years, and then again 105 years. It's a very special transit. But the deal with this, my friend, is that on 2004, it was a year we call Phi Flint, which is Makwili Tekpat on the ancient Mexica chronological system.
Right.
And the Venus transit that happened. Okay, imagine in your mind the Aztec calendar.
I'm afraid on my human, network calendar, my time is running out. So help me just get to that part just so I can understand. What do you think will happen in 2012? I wish I had time for all of that.
I think he's saying that there's going to be an experience of unity consciousness.
Unity consciousness?
I understand. In 2012, if we make it to that, my friend, we will be okay.
If we make it to that.
Yes, sir. Between now and then, what happened in 2004 had not happened. Of those, all the consequences that came together that are on these stones, what we call the Aztec calendar, the Coliche, since 1518. That's the last time all this came together. And at that time, 1518 to 1526, was a destruction of our way of life, apparently, because we kept it in our hearts.
Well,
nonetheless, here we are again, and we need to come up and come together, like he says, and I agree with that 100%.
Well, I appreciate that.
I would say that there's this idea that it's a kind of unity consciousness, or this kind of, and I talk about the idea of the noosphere, the kind of planet mind coming into conscious realization, so that we do have this recognition, as he discussed, that we're all each other's precious twin.
Well, and as he also said, if we make it. Which stood out.
So let's make it.
Let's make it. 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, the book from Daniel Pinchbeck. So enjoyed the conversation.
Me too.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you, everybody. Sorry we had to strand so many callers on the phone, but you're always welcome to email in your comments. Perhaps Art himself will return next week. If not, I'll be here. And in the meantime, Deus te amat. And
kind of evolutionary process. So, we had to gain this knowledge, this technological knowledge. We also had to alienate ourselves from nature, create this separate ego structure, so that we could really see things on a deeper level in terms of our science and our technology. But now, having made that separation, it's not the end of the road. The next step is a kind of reintegration at a higher level of consciousness. And that's the work that awaits us now, and the work that we have to do as individuals. If enough of us do it as individuals, the whole thrust of the society will naturally shift.
But still, I'm stuck with what you wrote, which I thought was very insightful, about this idea of a psychic blockade from a shamanic perspective that keeps us from being able to understand everything that really is going on. It forces us to think about the trivial, the trivial and the treacly, shoe sales.
Well, part of it is this fear culture, because as long as you're in this materialistic, nihilistic perspective, all that can matter to you is this life and this body and your immediate circumstances. So you kind of become frozen by anxiety, and therefore you can't think on a larger perspective. I mean, one thing I discuss in the book is how there's pretty excellent data now for supporting the theory of reincarnation. When you look at this guy, Ian Stevenson's research on children and past life memories, and even these children would have they would go back and they would find their previous incarnations and find that they had birthmarks that matched the wounds that had ended these past lives. He was a professor at the University of Virginia. Then there's this physicist, Amit Goswami, who's done this work really suggesting that quantum physics provides a basis for a hypothesis of how karma and reincarnation could function. So I think that our science is approaching, now able to sort of approach these subjects in a way.
All right. Well, then let's pick that up there when we continue with Danielle Pinchbeck. And I also want to tie back in, you're talking about UFO abductions and more on Coast to Coast AM. No words of Ross? No. You're listening to Coast AM with Art Bell, with guest host Ian Punnett. Okay. All right. So it's Coast to Coast AM with Art Bell, but Art has the night off. We think he might be back next week, but if not, I'll be here. And actually, Ross Mitchell will be then doing Coast to Coast Live, which that's something which these indigenous cultures have that's of great value. How would we be able to incorporate that into our culture, though, which seems so focused on the modern and the scientific? How would we be able to make that jump to include something which, we would use a word like primitive to try to describe?
Well, I think that those are the kind of words we may have to interrogate really, really deeply. And there may be a knowledge system that's been preserved by indigenous cultures, which is not primitive at all, which is super sensitive and sophisticated. And according to the Hopi, they talk about how at the end of the cycle, the elder white brother is going to come back and really be unpatronizing, uncondescending finally, and really try to share knowledge with them and learn from them too, because there may be things that these indigenous cultures have preserved as knowledge systems. They're going to be absolutely necessary for our near-term survival as a species.
I love the thought of that. I hope we do. We're long overdue to do that. How would our culture change? How would our day-to-day change if we could start doing more of what you seek for us?
Well, it's not anything that I seek for us. I mean, for me, it's like, and I try not to be prescriptive. I think it's happening. It will happen naturally, but it's up to the individuals to make a shift in perspective. It's like your whole world shifts when you make a shift in perspective. Everything shifts. Like William Carlos Williams said, a new world is only a new mind. So if you begin to move into this other framework of thought, then you begin to shift the whole reality around you. So if enough people start to do that, we could create a whole transformed situation.
Well, it seems like it was the quote that I read at the beginning of the hour, that you are identifying a problem and offering a kind of prognosis if we don't treat the problem. So if I put it in a prescriptive sense, and you didn't mean that way, I'm sorry, but you were talking about the psychic blockade in the book as being that which prevents us from being able to be healed from where we are. Who's responsible for the psychic blockade?
Yeah, well, and in that same chapter, I really talk about loss of soul also, that there's like this relationship to the anima, or the anima mundi, which is the soul of the world, that has been severed by the modern culture and modern civilization. And for me, once again, I see everything as a non-dual.
Was a recorded show tonight, just one of our first, but it could be Ross doing it next week. I think that'll be fun. And by the way, before, in the first hour of this show, Coast to Coast AM, we had gotten a few words on an update from Linda Godfrey. Linda Godfrey, journalist turned author who'd been working on these books about werewolves in the United States and tracking all of the various news accounts, reports, sightings of werewolves. And she had been experiencing one recently that she was on the trail of. And she talked just kind of coincidentally about something which I think goes right back into this conversation about the appearance of the white buffalo. And this is an all-white buffalo as opposed to an albino. And now in the same part of Wisconsin where there had been an all-white buffalo born, there are now sightings of all-white deer as well. And she said, this is very important. These are omens. These are signs. And so are many of the things which Daniel Pinchbeck talks about in the book 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl. And we'll tie that in with the other things he mentioned last hour, sometimes offhandedly, about UFOs, about abductions, about crop circles, and more next on Coast to Coast AM. In for Art, this is Ian Punnett. 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, author and wizard Daniel Pinchbeck with us on Coast to Coast AM. I want to go back to something you said last hour. I want to go back to about 5 things you said last hour, but the first of which is, just for the sake of argument, because I think you hit on a really interesting point. How would you define America's street drug problem in terms of what you have experienced with these other drugs around the world? That is to say, I mean, how do we look at the difference between drugs and medicines?
Well, I think our street drug problem is actually a spiritual crisis. I mean, it's a manifestation of our spiritual crisis. People turn to these substances. I mean, first of all, it's absolutely natural to seek altered states of consciousness. I mean, as Andrew Weil and many other people have pointed out, kids, will naturally whirl around or hold their breath, or do anything they can to experience altered states of consciousness. So it seems to be a natural dispensation to being human that you want to have experiences of different states of consciousness. Now, when you sort of artificially legislate against that and create a culture where there's really no kind of opening to sort of spiritual or mystical realities, people will seek sort of degraded substitutes for those kind of experiences, and they'll take whatever they can get their hands on.
All right. So then, in terms of, like you had mentioned, one particular type of medicine that you had taken, which gave an intense 5 or 6 minute effect. Right? What was the drug you mentioned?
Oh, yeah, I talked about dimethyltryptamine, or DMT.
Right. What's the difference between that, say, and how people describe the effects of crack, which is powerful but only lasts a few minutes?
Right. Well, I mean, that's interesting. I mean, first of all, there's DMT, dimethyltryptamine, is a component in ayahuasca. And as I also mentioned, very interestingly, DMT is a component in our spinal cord, and it's a brain chemical that's very similar to melatonin and serotonin. It's a tryptamine. It may be secreted by the pineal gland. There's a very interesting book about it called DMT, the Spirit Molecule, by Dr. Rick Straussman, which I recommend. But yeah, when you extract DMT and smoke it, you're taking something that's been kind of synthetically treated, at least in this extraction. The difference, I mean, I've never done crack, so I can't really say what crack is like, but my understanding is that's more like a sudden rush of euphoria, kind of blinding sort of flood of pleasure to the pleasure sensors. The DMT experience is the hallucinogenic plunge into this incredibly hyper-real other reality. And you only spend a few minutes in this other reality, but it feels like a very long time. And you have the sense of these kind of super sentient entities or guardians or world makers who are kind of laughing at you and watching over you and playing with you. It's almost more than your brain can take or hold. So yeah, it's a deeply ecstatic in all senses of the term kind of experience of a different reality. I think it's very different than crack or coke or heroin.
And over time, I mean, do these substances, these medicines, are they as addictive as our street drugs?
No, none of the psychedelics are addictive at all. I mean, I've done DMT twice and would probably be happy never to take it again. So yeah, there doesn't seem to be much addictive potential for most of the psychedelic substances. I mean, there can be a psychological addiction, and I think that, once again, we have this kind of consumerist mindset. So anything that we explore, we tend to bring that mindset to, or if we get a certain reaction, we want to go and get another reaction right after. But I think that the way that, these indigenous cultures use these substances and have used them safely for a really long time suggests that they just don't have the kind of negative ramifications of our street drugs.
Then what is different, or how are shamans oriented so differently that they might use these particular medicines over the course of time and don't end up like some crack addict, or end up like, some person whose life is crushed because of the substances that they took?
Yeah, well, you really have to discriminate between substances and have to, becoming, as I'm talking about transformation in consciousness, becoming more conscious and more intelligent requires a deeper sort of understanding of subtleties. And really, when you look at these substances, there's massive good work on it. I wouldn't necessarily trust what the government says, but there's a lot of research on psychedelics, and they're not addictive. They're not destructive. They can be misused. They can cause sort of negative episodes. They can. If people use them in unprotected situations, they can lead to people jumping out windows. That does happen. So that's why it's really interesting to think about exploring this more shamanic realm. And for me, it's like when you go into these indigenous cultures, you're actually connecting with the lineage, and that has a certain protective aspect to it also.
Sure.
So it's different than just tripping in your college campus or, at home, in a totally desacralized secular context.